this is a calico work dress. I couldn't possibly.
Yes, absolutely. Great line. Great line.
Welcome to Land of Laura, the irreverent yet scholarly podcast about all things Laura Ingalls Wilder. As soon as I knew I was starting this podcast, I knew that Laura Keyes had to be a guest. She's a librarian and historic interpreter from Illinois who portrays historical women in presentations both in person and online, including Laura Ingalls Wilder and Mary Todd Lincoln. In fact, shortly after we recorded this podcast, Laura won the Mary Todd Lincoln Oratory Contest, and not for the first time, at the Lincoln Days celebration in Hodgenville, Kentucky. Laura is also an expert in historical clothing, and even though fashion is not an interest of mine and probably never will be, there's something about Laura Ingalls Wilder that makes me care about the things she cared about. So today, we're going to talk about calico and lawn and poplin and cashmere. In other words, the dresses of the Little House books. Laura, thank you for lending your expertise to the podcast today.
Thank you for having me, Sandra.
I am so excited for you to be here because I don't know anything about dresses, but I have been preparing for this. I made a table. I went through as many books as I could and I made lists of the dresses, and I can't wait to ask you about them. We start every episode, if a guest has not been on before, by asking them their Laura Ingalls Wilder or their Little House origin story. Laura Keyes, what is your Little House origin story?
Well, it's actually difficult for me to answer that because I don't remember being introduced to it. It has simply always been in my life. I believe that my mother read us some of the books as a child. I definitely remember my third grade teacher reading Little House on the Prairie and then The Long Winter, as well as a few other books, to the whole class during the course of third grade. But even then, I had already heard them. I already knew the story. So I can't remember when I was first introduced to it. It was just always there.
So how did that carry through to your adulthood?
So in 2008, I started portraying Mary Todd Lincoln and quickly decided that this is something that I wanted to do and a way to share different parts of history. I've mentioned Mary Todd Lincoln, also Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and two women who are specific to Illinois history, where I currently live. Lucy Pettengill was a station operator on the Underground Railroad, and I share her story in 1857. And also Elizabeth Packard, who was confined to the state insane asylum in 1860 because her husband didn't like her opinions.
Oh, I would love to see that presentation.
Yes, I do enjoy sharing these stories from history. It was a number of years later that a friend of mine who was a museum director asked me to put together an accurate portrayal of Laura Ingalls Wilder. And I was initially very cautious because I wanted to portray her accurately. I didn't want to have a stereotype of what was on the television show. And I knew that the books were not accurate. They're labeled as fiction. And so it took me a while to say yes. But of course, when I did, I dove into the research, the wonderful research that had been done by William Anderson, Pamela Smith Hill, John Miller, and others on the true life and experiences of Mrs. Wilder. And through that and through a lot of their research, I have been able to put together, I think right now I have 5 programs as Laura Ingalls Wilder and a lecture just on the fashion of Laura Ingalls Wilder.
And that is why we're here today. So how did you come to find yourself specializing in the fashion of Laura Ingalls Wilder?
I became very intrigued by so many of the descriptions in the books. And I also realized that there was a huge misconception by the general public that out on the prairie, all the ladies just wore a flowered calico dress all the time. All the time, and it was usually dirty. I decided I need to explain how fashion worked. Yes, a dress such as that would have been worn to do the gardening, would have been worn to do the chores.
This is a calico work dress. I couldn't possibly.
Yes, absolutely. Great line. Great line. There was just a lot of misconceptions, and that's what I am setting about to change.
Your knowledge of pioneer clothing is so impressive. So I really wanted to talk about the dresses from these happy golden years in particular. But I have to say, I kind of included some little town dresses and some Plum Creek dresses. And maybe if we have time and if you say it's okay, we can talk about Mazda Lane. I don't know. Let's see. Some of the best experiences people have reading the Laura Ingalls Wilder books are reading about the clothing, specifically the dresses. She's very, very specific in how she describes the dresses. Why do we remember those dresses that she describes so well?
I think that a lot of readers remember the dresses described in these happy golden years, especially so well, because Mrs. Wilder describes pretty much all their stages of construction. And then mostly she describes wearing them for the first time. And especially with the brown poplin, she describes putting it on for the first time. And it's just one of these things where not only is the reader left with a very complete sense of what this dress is and what it looks like and what it feels like and everything like that. But I truly believe that it's because Mrs. Wilder, as the author, was remembering all of these dresses because she had a much bigger hand in creating them than she did earlier in her life. It's also very probable that young Miss Ingalls, young Laura Ingalls, enjoyed these dresses for the first time. I'm sure we'll get into more detail, but it's just so likely that as a child, truly a child, Laura Ingalls didn't have much to say about what she wore, and therefore it was unmemorable.
What did seem to be memorable to her, if I can recall correctly, were the details of the dresses worn by the women or the young women like Aunt Ruby and Aunt Dosha at the sugaring off dance in Little House in the Big Woods.
Yes. What I like to remind folks when I am asked to talk, to give a lecture on the fashion that Laura Ingalls Wilder had in her time, I like to remind folks that so many of the details that Mrs. Wilder, as the author, put into her books were almost certainly taken from her memory. We know this woman had a prodigious memory. And what's more, the details that she puts into her books are things like what are the specific buttons that the woman had on her dress? What was the pattern of the cloth? Those details are at eye level for a child. That is something a child would remember. And it's likely that that's what a child would fixate on.
That is a really good point, and I hadn't quite thought of it that way. I would like to talk about Plum Creek for a second, because aside from the young ladies in Big Woods, the first dress that I noticed, and I could have missed something, but the first dress that I noticed being described is actually Nellie Olson's.
Ah, yes.
And it's thin white lawn with little blue flowers scattered on it. And not only do we get a description of Nellie's dress, we get a description of Nellie's doll's dress. She has her china doll, which is pure china, but then she has her wax doll. And her dress is blue silk. How often do we hear mentions of pure silk dresses in the Little House books?
The brown poplin is made out of a silk blend cloth.
Really?
Yes, I'd have to go back and double check that. A blend of silk. And also, Mary's best dress for college, I think, has silk trimming. But you're absolutely right. To have an entire dress made out of silk is notable.
That is why I'm talking to you. This is so fun. This is so fun.
I will say that you are correct that in the book On the Banks of Plum Creek, when Laura and Mary go to Nellie's party and see her dolls and see her pretty home and, you know, really all of her toys, that is after the chapter in which the girls go to school for the first time. That is when, for the first time, Laura notices other people noticing her dress. If you remember the little incident of some of the other school children's calling Laura and Mary snipes because they have such long legs. And actually the illustration, of course, I'm looking at an edition illustrated by Garth Williams, does show that Laura and Mary's dresses are shorter than the other dresses, simply because Ma probably doesn't have the cloth to make them longer. So it is in this book that the child, Laura, for the first time, is noticing how other people notice what she wears.
That is really telling. That is really telling. So the first really detailed look at a dress, according to my cursory research, seems to be Mary's best dress for college, which is, first of all, does that sound right to you?
I think if we put aside the detailed description of Ma's Delane from Little House in the Big Woods, which we can put aside for the moment, I think I would agree with you.
It's brown cashmere, and it was called woolen, and it was lined with brown cambric. And I have a question for you. What is the difference between cambric and muslin?
To answer your question about cambric, which is sometimes called cambric, I think it can be pronounced both ways, is...
Oh, I just made that up in my head. I just, I don't claim to know how it's pronounced. So cambric. Okay.
So that is typically made from linen, from flax, ultimately from flax. However, over the years, it did come to describe a fabric which could have been made out of cotton or something other than flax that simply looked like fine linen cambric. And your other question was about muslin. Muslin, I wouldn't quite call it a rough fabric, but it wasn't usually a fine fabric. It was just a middling fabric. Definitely underclothing could be made out of muslin and some lining. And of course, it doesn't matter the way that it's woven. If it's woven very neatly and finely, then it could be a dressier fabric.
Another dress that I saw mentioned that I think I've just sort of skated over without realizing I don't know what it is, was Ma's Summer Chalice. Do you know what a chalice is?
Yes, chalice is a type of printed woolen cloth. And since it is a type of printed woolen cloth, I believe that it could actually be her Delane dress described in Little House in the Big Woods that has been made over for Ma as, as she aged, as perhaps her body grew or changed. And of course, the fashions changed. We have to remember that fabric was still relatively precious. And we see that subtly from some of the descriptions that we have in the books. We were just talking about Laura and Mary the first time that they went to school in the books were wearing dresses with pretty high hemlines. I am making the assumption that it's because the dresses still fit them, even though they were made for them before their last growth spurt. The odds are high that Caroline didn't have the luxury of just going to get cloth whenever she wanted it.
So they just continued to make over their clothing.
Yes. If the clothing held up, which it often did, it could be remade. And again, we have a description of that in the book, on the banks of Plum Creek. There's one scene where Carrie is described as wearing a little pink dress that Laura used to wear. And Mrs. Wilder, as the author, puts that into the book. She remembers wearing that as a child, but now Carrie is wearing it. And in the next book, By the Shores of Silver Lake, the curtains of the house are described as being edged with a thin pink calico taken from the dress that Carrie wore.
Wow.
Fabric was reused and reused and reused.
Until it ended up in a rug.
Yes.
Is that true? I'm just guessing.
Until it's every single use was used out of it. Rugs, of course, were not only practical, but they were a way to put scraps of cloth to use. Quilts, of course, were a very visual and could be a very artistic way of using up scraps of clothing. But rags were also used for cleaning, even for cleaning oneself. And so they were often used for that until every use had been wrung out of them.
The other two dresses that are described besides the Ingalls girls' dresses, and described instead of just mentioned, because a couple of dresses are certainly mentioned, but these two that are described in detail are actually dresses worn by Laura's nemesis. We will get to Nellie Olson, who we've already talked about, but she also describes Miss Wilder's dress. Her dark gray dress was stylishly made like Mary's best one, tight and straight in the front, with a pleated ruffle just touching the floor, and an overskirt draped and puffed above a little train. And I remember reading that and thinking, she shouldn't have a dress as nice as Mary's.
I remember reading it and thinking, this is awfully nice for teaching school in DeSmet. And yet we have to remember that the school teacher was a position of respect in the community, and therefore one dressed smartly, professionally. And that's probably what Eliza Jane was doing.
And with what we know now, likely had it made back in Minnesota.
Very probably, yes.
And then, of course, there's Nellie's dress when Nellie shows up at the school. She's wearing a fawn-colored dress made with a polonaise. Deep pleated ruffles were around the bottom of the skirt, around her neck, and falling from the edges of the wide sleeves. At her throat was a full jabot of lace. And in that description are two words that I have never really thought about trying to define. And I'm so excited that I can ask you. Please tell me, if you can, what is a polonaise? I have a little idea, maybe. And what is a jabot?
A polonaise is a long overbodice that can go to about knee length, definitely mid-thigh. And it's fitted to the body, usually without a waist seam. And therefore, it's just all a nice straight line on the female body.
Is it like an A-line?
No.
No.
I wouldn't call it that. It's... If one does find the book, Little Town on the Prairie, and once again, I am very much complimenting Garth Williams' illustrations on page 131. In my opinion, he illustrates this very well. The polonaise, some people might look at it and say, oh, it's like a long jacket.
Yes, that's exactly what I was thinking.
Well, more or less, but it typically was not worn over a blouse. That was the entire top. It wasn't a jacket over a blouse. So that's a bit of a difference. But as you can see in the illustration, and as is typical in a polonaise, it extends past the waist, possibly to the knee. It's long and quite fancy because you are using lots of fabric upon layers of fabric. It is not a simple dress. And of course, a pleated ruffle, that's more fabric. To have a ruffle means you use kind of twice as much fabric as that space allows. And so that's more money paying for those ruffles.
Wow, you're so right, though, about the, going right along the description that he really, really just drew exactly what she wrote.
Yes. We all know that Garth Williams did a huge amount of research into these books, and he was very talented. To answer your second question, you're speaking of a jabot.
Jabot.
Yes, it is a French word. And the jabot is, I've heard it described as an ornamental frill or ruffle on the front of a shirt or blouse, typically made of lace. Once again, you can see that in the illustration. And once again, we can see that a lot of lace, whether purchased or whether created, as we do know, it was very typical to knit or crochet one's own lace. And there are obviously other ways of creating lace, like with bobbins, but that took time. That took a lot of time and energy.
Mm-hmm.
Whichever way you obtained that lace, whether by paying for it or by creating it, that's a lot of lace. And there are a couple dresses that Laura and Mary wear that have no mention of lace. And it's probably because of the time that was expended in order to create it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I seem to remember she made lace, and I feel like some of the lace that she knitted ended up on Mary's underwear. Remember how she says nobody's underwear would be prettier than Mary's? But maybe I'm remembering wrong.
You are remembering correctly. At the beginning of The Long Winter, I do believe Laura Ingalls is described as crocheting lace. And she does give that lace that she crochets to Mary as a Christmas gift in that same book. In These Happy Golden Years, the newly engaged Laura Ingalls is described as knitting lace when she is on a break from teaching school. And later on in the book, These Happy Golden Years, Laura Ingalls describes how she was very impressed that the new sewing machine fastened that lace to her new bed linens so quickly.
I am going to need to fully reread these books over again just to get all this. Thank you so much for those details. I'm going to mention a couple of other dresses before I get into the major ones. Laura does go into a tiny bit of detail when she goes to the sociable, not about her own. Well, she does go into a whole lot of detail about her own dress, but she mentions Mrs. Tinkham's dress as being a black dress with white lace ruffles at throat and wrists. And when she goes to the birthday party at Ben Woodworth's, she mentions that his mother's dress was a soft, thin gray dress with snowy white ruffles at throat and wrists, which actually sounds very similar to the description of Mrs. Tinkham's dress now that I say them side by side. There's also Carrie's school exhibition dress, which is described as a bright plaid woolen. And what's interesting about that dress is that Laura compliments Carrie's appearance in the dress as a way to soothe her sister's nerves. So very much equating what they're wearing with their self-worth.
You're absolutely right. And that is a definite change. For example, in pretty much the whole of The Long Winter, this focus on clothing does not exist because that is not the important part of that book. The important part of that book is survival.
Right.
So to contrast that with this scene that you remember very well, that Laura is trying to calm the nerves of Carrie by complimenting what she's wearing, I think it's significant not only in the development of the fictional characters, Laura and Carrie, but it also does have to do with with what they're taking part in, an exhibition, speaking in public. This was something that neither of them had done before. And many people, I'm sure people listening to this podcast, don't like public speaking. And so it's very common to just plain get nervous, especially on your very first time.
You and I have talked in the past about why Laura might have decided to go into such detail about the clothes. And you spoke of it in terms of she really didn't have much say in what she wore when she was younger, and then she did as she became a teenager.
You've summed it up very well. According to the books, it really isn't until the latter half of On the Banks of Plum Creek that we have any scene where Ma asks Laura what she thinks about a color, a color of cloth that Ma will then make into a dress. There is no discussion on what the dress will look like. I will say that. But that's the first description that we have. And throughout By the Shores of Silver Lake, there isn't that much description on the clothing either. But once we get into the world of Little Town on the Prairie, the Ingalls family is regularly working with, socializing with other people. And it is not just family members, as they pretty much only socialized with family members in Little House in the Big Woods. So now we have Little Town on the Prairie, and that book begins with the fictional Laura Ingalls, probably 14 years old, if we're keeping her with about the same age of the real Laura Ingalls, about 14. That means she's a teenager. And just like so many other teenagers throughout time, before the word teenager was even invented, teenagers have started to care about what they look like and how others perceive them. That in and of itself hasn't changed. To emphasize that it has not changed, we literally have a scene in Little Town on the Prairie where Laura Ingalls just plain looks at herself in the mirror for a while and wonders how her hair should be dressed and what she thinks about her image and her face, and she contrasts it and compares it with her friends, and she compliments her friends. Her friends are slimmer, her friends have better bone structure, various things. That's very typical of a teenager. And so that's why I believe Mrs. Wilder, when she became an author, really remembered those feelings that she had as a teenager. And one of the ways to just plain illustrate those feelings is to give them a tactile, permanent object, and those objects are clothing. Through the clothing, through the description of clothing, through the comments on clothing, you actually can see the occasionally tumultuous feelings that Laura Ingalls, the teenager, had.
And the scene that you're talking about, I think, is right before she goes to the sociable. Well, actually, she does, I think, spends time looking in the mirror before going to the sociable and before going to Ben Woodworth's party. And she definitely does compare herself to her friends, though I do believe it is before the sociable that she decides to cut her lunatic fringe.
That's the lunatic fringe.
Yes. But her dress is described as well. And from my reviewing all of the dresses, I have realized something that I never knew before, that she seems to have two best dresses in Little Town on the Prairie. Her first best dress, her Sunday best, is a blue cashmere. And her second best dress is a brown woolen dress made in princess style. And that is the one that she wears to the sociable. The collar was a high, tight band close under Laura's chin, and the skirt came down to the tops of her high-buttoned shoes. It was a very pretty dress with piping of red around wrists and collar, and the buttons all down the front were of brown horn, with a tiny raised castle in the center of each one. And that excerpt is from page 202 to 203 in the chapter called The Sociable in the Garth Williams Illustrated Edition.
I think that brown dress is described as being made one winter before the blue dress, if I'm remembering correctly.
Oh, maybe.
Yes. What I remember of reading that description is that it was a very brief description, almost about 2 sentences, describing Laura's best winter dress. If you contrast that to the fact that when earlier in the book, Laura and Ma are described making Mary's best winter dress, it took about 5 pages to describe.
Yes.
And so I believe that at the time, Laura Ingalls wasn't happy with the brown woolen made in the princess style. I don't know if it was truly jealousy, but she was just comparing it in her mind to Mary's and said, well, it's not as good as Mary's. And therefore, as author, Mrs. Wilder took about 2 sentences to describe it and went on with another subject.
I think you may be right. And there's a point in the book, in the chapter School Time Begins Again, towards the end of the book on page 271, where Laura says, at least to herself, Mary Power had a new school dress. Minnie Johnson had a new coat and new shoes. Ida's clothes came out of a missionary barrel, but Ida was so sweet and merry that she looked perfectly dear in anything. When Laura dressed for school, it seemed to her that the more she fussed with her appearance, the more dissatisfying it was. And if that isn't a teenage thought, I don't know what one is.
You're absolutely right.
What is a princess style?
Yeah, so according to my research, the princess style was first introduced in 1848, but it wasn't very fashionable until the 1860s. And in fashion magazines, it was occasionally called the Gabrielle cut.
Mm-hmm.
And there is some debate over which European princess style this was named for. But think of it this way. The dress is constructed with shoulder to hem seams, no waist seams. And I'll try to explain that in another way. Now, remember, the vast majority of ladies' dresses consisted of a few large pieces of fabric for the skirt, and then medium to small size pieces for the bodice, the sides. But the princess style dress was just a few long pieces connected at the shoulder and then hemmed, and then small tubes for the sleeves. The princess style of dress requires an enormous amount of confidence on the part of the seamstress, for there are no places to just gather the tucks together, hide your mistakes, hide it with a bow. You know, there isn't that option on the princess style dress. If you were to find an image of a princess style dress, the talent is in the seamstress, that she could curve and cut the pieces, various long pieces of cloth, just so that they curved in and they cut into the waist, and then they flared out again to make the larger skirt.
Wow. Okay, so that was her brown dress. And her best dress is blue cashmere. And she describes it as a young lady's dress so long that it hid the high tops of her buttoned shoes. The full gathered skirt was gathered as full in the back as it could possibly be. Over it fitted the tight basque that came down in points in front and in back, and buttoned snugly with little green buttons straight up the front. A band of blue and gold and green plaid went around the skirt just above the hem, and narrow strips of plaid edged the pointed bottom of the basque and went around the wrists of the tight, long sleeves. Gosh, I get claustrophobic just thinking about those tight, long sleeves. The upstanding collar was of the plaid, with a frill of white lace inside it, and Ma had lent Laura her pearl shell pin to fasten the collar together under her chin. And that's from page 241 in the chapter The Birthday Party, where she's kind of analyzing her looks before heading out with Mary Power to Ben Woodworth's house.
Yes, I think that's a dress that young Miss Ingalls was very pleased with, as she describes it so well.
And she has lace.
Yes, yes. Something that I will point out in that description is specifically when it's described that a band of the blue and gold and green plaid went around the skirt just above the hem. And then it says narrow strips of the plaid edge the pointed bottom of the basque. So that's a decoration. The plaid cloth it's a decoration to the solid color of the blue cashmere. To be perfectly blunt, this is a cheaper way to dress up a dress. They are not complementing the blue cashmere fabric with huge amounts of lace. Lace is only mentioned once around the collar, and if you think about it, that's not many inches of lace. They are not using any ribbons in order to dress up this dress. They are using cloth. I have no doubt that it was a nicely complemented cloth and the colors all went together, but this is another way of just kind of cheaply dressing up a dress. It didn't cost that much money.
Before we get into poplins, there's a lot of mention of lawn dresses. Mary has a lawn dress. Ma has a lawn dress. Carrie has a lawn dress. Laura has the pink lawn that is described as being made as, I guess, part of her trousseau at that point. What is lawn?
So lawn is a lightweight cloth. It was typically linen, but it could actually be cotton or a cotton linen blend. The main point is that it was lightweight.
It's often referred to as a summer dress.
Yes, it was light to wear and easier dress to wear in the summer.
So the brown poplin not only has the longest description of any dress besides Mary's, it also has its own chapter.
Yes, you're absolutely right.
It has its own chapter named after it, almost like it's a character. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and say that the brown poplin is a character. I could read the whole description of it, but it's quite long. See if I can pull out some keywords. Brown cambric was the underskirt, which was gored to flare smoothly down over her hoops. There was a 12-inch wide flounce, just missing the floor at the very bottom, bound with an inch-wide band of plain brown silk. The poplin was not plain poplin, but striped with an openwork silk stripe. And then there was the starched white corset cover, and it had a polonaise. Oh, just like Nellie Olson.
Yes, you finally got one, just like Nellie Olson.
Its smooth long sleeves fitted her arms perfectly to the wrists. Now I'm just reading. Where a band of the plain silk ended them. The neck was high with a smooth band of the plain silk around the throat. The polonaise fitted tightly and buttoned all down the front with small round buttons covered with the plain brown silk. Below the smooth hips it flared and rippled down and covered the top of the flounce on the underskirt. A band of the plain silk finished the polonaise at the bottom. Around the brown silk neckband, Laura placed a blue ribbons, 2 inches wide. She pinned it together at her throat with the pearl bar pin that Ma had given her. The ends of the ribbon fell in streamers to her waist. That is a long ribbon.
Yes.
And I'm done. This is from the chapter called The Brown Poplin in These Happy Golden Years, and that's from page 162.
Yes, that whole dress was just fantastic. I think that Mrs. Wilder, when writing it, must have remembered her joy in wearing that, in being so happy that she had such a pretty new dress. And of course she was stepping out, with a handsome young man, and all that joy that can come in your childhood.
When you get that perfectly fitting whatever piece of clothing that you just want to show off.
You are absolutely right. If I didn't say it earlier, poplin is a fabric that was made from silk and worsted wool, and so a specifically type of twisted and finished wool. And so poplin could come in a variety of different styles, weavings, but it was a fabric that was definitely a blend of two properties.
Can you say just a little bit about how it wasn't plain but striped with an openwork silk stripe?
The best way I can imagine that is that it was a pretty fancy type of weaving. This must have been pretty specific for the cloth to be woven, and then in certain intervals, as we all know, cloth often it has a repeated pattern. At certain points, it could be that either the weft or the warp yarns of the wool were reduced greatly, and therefore the silk was predominant in that section, whether the section was a few inches long or many inches long, and then it went back to the more regular weaving, and then it repeated again where a lot of the wool yarn was temporarily removed. So
it appeared striped?
Yes, so it appered striped, and it's just so hard to describe without showing.
I know. I wonder if we can get some pictures in the show notes, if we can find any pictures. So what can you tell us about Godey's Ladies Book?
Godey's Ladies Book was very well established as a popular magazine by the time the Ingalls family would have been enjoying it. It was started by an owner called Louis Godey. That was his surname, Godey. And he bought another successful magazine called the American Ladies Magazine, and that was back in 1836. And he merged it with his own small to medium-sized women's magazine, but it just quickly became known as Godey's Ladies Book. And eventually they just leaned into it and said, that's the title of it now. And so it started with just 10,000 subscribers its first year, which is nothing to sneeze at, but for a nationwide magazine, that is kind of small.
Mm-hmm.
What Mr. Godey did, which was the smartest thing he did, is that when he bought that rival magazine, the American Ladies Magazine, in 1836, what he did is he also brought on its main editor, who was named Sarah Josepha Hale. Very unique to be the editor of a national magazine and a woman at that time.
No kidding.
Mrs. Hale was very intelligent, very good at her job, and a very good writer. And she was in that position until, I think it was 1877. She retired from working at the age of 89. It was that year that Mr. Godey sold the magazine, and he passed away soon afterwards. So that magazine just quickly became known as the standard. It was the most widely read magazine. This was the main way individuals on the prairie were able to get a lot of the news of fashion and news for the household. Yes, there were newspapers. Those were news. What was in the Godey's Ladies Book was not necessarily breaking news. It was, of course, hints about fashion. It also had actual patterns for some of the clothing that it showed in the fashion plates. It had recipes, stories. It had poems. It had tips on how to run your household. In my research, I have found some needlepoint or other embroidery patterns that were in the magazine. And Godey's Ladies book claims to be the first place that some of the most well-known American authors were published, including Nathaniel Hawthorne, Washington Irving, Edgar Allan Poe, and Harriet Beecher Stowe. That's what they claim. I will not claim to be an expert in American literature, but that's saying something. Wow.
It really is. And I guess the Ingalls weren't necessarily subscribers.
According to the books, it doesn't seem that they were subscribers. It does appear that they borrowed them. It's mentioned at least twice that they borrowed the book from Mrs. Boast. I believe in These Happy Golden Years, Laura looks at a Godey's Ladies book from one of the dressmakers that she works for. And of course, that would make sense for the dressmaker to have that, to be up with fashions. I wasn't able to find a price for a subscription in my research. Perhaps I'm not looking in the right areas. But of course, as we know, there were some times in the books where the family was described as barely having anything to eat. Mm-hmm. And so by no means could they spend money on a subscription when they can't spend money for good food.
Exactly. Not necessarily something that a pioneer family could easily fit into their budget. The last dress that's described in detail is the pink lawn. It's in the cream-colored hat chapter. I'm not getting into hats. I would like to get into hats, but I'm not. We're just talking about dresses. The pink lawn, they made the waist tight fitting with 2 clusters of tucks down the back and 2 in front. Down the center of the front, between the tucks, tiny white pearl buttons buttoned the waist. The collar was a straight upstanding fold of the lawn. The sleeves were long, gathered at the shoulders and close-fitting to the waist, finished with a hem the width of the tucks. The skirt was gathered very full all round into a narrow waistband, which buttoned over the bottom of the waist to secure them from slipping apart. All down the full skirt, tucks went around and around it, spaced evenly a little way apart, and beneath the bottom tuck was a full gathered ruffle 4 inches wide that just touched Laura's shoe tips. And the significance of this dress is that it is the first dress made with the sewing machine.
Yes, the sewing machine.
And I think Laura even comments after that she couldn't believe how easy the tucks were, maybe.
She does compliment the sewing machine, and I can only agree. In my life, I've sewn a lot of things. I will not claim to be a seamstress, however. And by that, I mean, I really don't have the skill to completely recreate these dresses, especially the ones that we've been describing. I have made myself petticoats. I have actually made a lot of curtains. Those are very different from making a dress. And so if I had to make those kind of garments by hand, I would, as Laura describes, fly to pieces.
Is there anything else we should say about this pink lawn?
It is adorable. I think that it's lovely, and a lovely light and feminine color. So many of the other dresses that were described were kind of a darker color, which makes sense. Darker colors hide the dirt. And it was very dusty. Living out on the prairie, dust is often described as just getting everywhere. And so I just love the description. I'm always intrigued about the description of white pearl buttons. If they were actual pearls that had been drilled through so that they could be used as small, completely spherical buttons, I would be very impressed. What is probable is that these were mother of pearl buttons, meaning that the shell from clams or another type of kind of cheap mussel were simply punched so that it's a round disc, and they look like pearl buttons, but they're strictly speaking mother of pearl. That would be more economical, but of course we don't know that detail. This is a dress that I attempted to recreate with the help of a very skilled seamstress. And for me personally, it was the first dress I wore with a bustle. And it really is a big bustle. And that was a lot of fun when I was able to put it on, sit in it, and prove that it is possible for a little kitten to climb up into the hoops.
Oh, it was the pink lawn she was wearing at church that day.
I do believe it was. And so I remember showing that off at a conference many years ago.
At one of the Laurapalooza conferences?
Yes, it was a conference hosted by the Laura Ingalls Wilder Legacy and Research Association.
We end up talking about that conference all the time. It is such a great time. So, Laura Keyes, where can people find you online?
All of my information is listed on my website, historicvoices.info, and I also have a Facebook page of Historic Voices. I'd be very happy if anyone were to come and say hi on one of those channels and let me know if you enjoyed our talk here with the podcast.
You have satisfied so many of my curiosities and hopefully did the same for listeners as well.
I am so pleased to be asked to share what I have learned with all of your listeners. And the most I can say is go back, reread all of the books, and enjoy what you can about the variety of descriptions of all of the clothing in them.
So we didn't get to talk about Mazda Lane, but fear not, another time indeed we will come back and talk all about Mazda Lane dress that she wears to the sugaring off dance in Little House in the Big Woods, and maybe determine whether that dress does indeed show up as a chalice in later books. Thank you for joining us today. Land of Laura is created and executive produced by me, Sandra Hume. Special thanks to Canadian folk punk band The Dreadnaughts for our theme music, and extra special thanks to all the guests, like Laura Keyes, who give so generously of their time and their knowledge. As Pa says, there's plenty more down cellar in a teacup. And as Mom might have said, it takes all kinds of people to make a Little House world.